Howdy folks. Today we're going to talk about classes in JavaScript. So classes are kind of a syntactic sugar around objects. So we know what an object is. If I say, let's say I have a type of user, for instance, and I have, okay, user, oops, and their name, well, let's say username. And then we have a password for them. And then maybe we have an email. And then let's say maybe we have a method assigned to it too, because we can assign methods to users. Okay, so maybe I have a verify login method. You might notice I'm using the arrow function here, which I actually shouldn't do because this is an object. I should be using a method. In order to figure out why that is, you should watch the video on ES6 methods, or ES6 stuff. But suffice to say, because the function holds on to the context of the user, whereas the arrow function does not. So let's say maybe I do a verify login, and I'm just like, okay, do some login stuff, and return true if the user is able to actually log in. Okay, so that's cool. So I have a user, and I can say, so let's do an info. Let's do an info method as well. And I'm going to console log with a template. My user is this.username, and email is this.email. Okay, so I've got my user, and I can call user.info. And no, I need to go to. If I run that, you can see it prints out, calls this function, because this function belongs to the object. Because it's a method, it has access to this, being the user, and an email. Okay, well, let's say I want to do another user. Well, I have to copy this entire thing. I'm going to call them user2. Okay, and this one is maybe a different user. They've got a different different email. Okay, but the verify login is still the same, and the info is still the same. So then I can say, okay, user2 info. I run that. Look at here. What if I need 10 more users? Well, that's kind of a lot because I have to keep duplicating this entire structure, and then at some point, I'm going to make one more just for show. Okay, this is going to be user 3. And this is going to be changing, and then same verify, login, same info, user3.info. Okay. Well, let's say now that in addition to username, password, and email, we also want to store user ID. So, okay, I'm going to say ID 1, ID 2, and I have to go through every single one of these and add in the ID. Then I have to go into info, and then let's say I want to print that out. This to ID, copy that over. There. Now, obviously, I could take this function and make it an actual function and then just pass it in to info. That'd be fine. But you can see little changes like this I have to do to every single object. This is not very efficient. So what to do? Well, what I can do is I can actually instead make a constructor method. And I can create a function, I can call it makeUser. Okay, takes in ID, username, password, email, and then it actually just returns this user. So I can say, okay, user, return user, user.id equals ID, user.username, username.password, user.email, user.verify login, and I can actually just pop this in here, equals that, and then I can do the same thing with info. So what has this done? This has given me a method that basically does the same thing as each of these does, but it allows me to kind of move that. So instead of user equals this whole thing, I can say user equals make user, one, the username, the password, and the email. That takes a little less time. You can see what was before. What is this? 12 lines is now 1 line. And if I run this code, you can see it's still the same exact thing. So I'm going to do this to the rest of them. All right, I'm going to say make user 2, my password, test.com. Okay, and I'll do this for the third one as well. Oops.com. All right, and so now if I do that, let me just run it to make sure I haven't made any mistakes. Works fine. This is good. Now, make user, it's not completely clear off the bat that that actually returns an object, right? If I'm looking at this, I could see from this, oh yeah, this returns an object. It's not 100% clear, and there's a little tiny piece of syntactic sugar that we can put on top of this that makes it very clear that we're getting a new object every time. Because make user, well, from this name it could do it makes a user, right? But sometimes it's not always clear that the function returns an object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a capital function. Why did that? There's no real reason. It just makes it look nicer. It makes it clear that, like, okay, that's a user. Okay, I run that again. Still no difference. Now here's the fun part. What I'm going to do is, you see this user has this, when I make a new user object here, I return it and I set a bunch of stuff on here. I'm going to get rid of that. Instead, I'm going to put this like that. What happened? Now it's not going to work, right? Because if I run this, okay, it says, hey, there's nothing returned from this, but I'm going to put a special keyword on it. New. Now it all works. So what does new do? It basically does what we had before. Before we had our object and we were returning the object and everything, we set properties on the object, right? The new keyword, if you call a function with new, it basically does that for you on your behalf. It automatically makes an object and then calls the function with that object as the context. So your this becomes the new object. So in this case, I'm saying new user. It makes a new object, calls user function to populate that object, and then the result is going to be that object. So we can see everything works exactly as it did before. Let me put this side by side again with the old make user. Right, so then that was const this object, object, object. I'm realizing right now I should have done this in reverse, but that's okay. And then return object. So then instead of, I'm going to make user 2 use make user, and these two use the new user. And you can see there's no difference. They do the exact same thing. So this one sets all these properties, has an object already created for it, and returns it magically. This one has to create the object, sets the properties, and has to return the object. The only difference is one of them has this new in front of it, and the other does not. So that's the first type of class, what we call a constructor function. Why do we call it a constructor function? Because this function, when we call it, essentially constructs the new object. It's building the new object. This is technically also what we more call of like a factory function, where it creates the object and then sets its properties and returns it, but it's doing that stuff deliberately. Whereas the new keyword makes that object and returns it by default. Why do we do that? Well, because it's very clear in this instance that a new object is being created. If I say make user, I can probably guess that a new object is being created out of that. But with new user, it's impossible to do anything else. So I could actually make a function called make user that doesn't return the object. Maybe it does something else. Maybe it stores it to the database. It's not super clear. But with the new, you know a new object has to be created. So it just makes your code a little bit more clear. All right. So that's a constructor function. you can see we've added in properties as well. There's a couple other ways you can add functions after the fact. I'm going to get rid of this. So let's say that we want to add a method to our user to store their data in a database, right? So maybe we have like an update username, and it needs to go there. We could actually do this dot update username function new username. This dot username equals new username. But what if we don't have access to this code? What if user is something that is defined elsewhere, and either one, we don't have permission to touch that code because it's not our team's responsibility, or two, it's part of a node module that we've installed, but we can't modify that code directly because that's just not how node modules work. We want to add a function to this class without making it so that we're modifying the original method. What we can do is we can use the prototype. So I can say user.prototype.update username equals function. Now, if I call user update username 2, and then I call user.info again, oops. You can see it does make that change. Even though this method is not actually done on the user object, the user2 or the user3 object, it's done on the prototype. Because we use new user like this, anything in the prototype of user automatically gets applied to every single one of these methods. Let's say I created this beforehand. No difference. Even though I created the new user before I actually set the prototype, it's still, that function still gets populated on. This is commonly used for if you need to modify built-ins. So like, let's say you're needing to change an array, for instance, you can use prototype to add a new method to the array. So that's our prototype. Normally you don't want to do this. You want to put this in the constructor function, but sometimes you can't get away from it. If you need to add some functionality to a third-party library, for instance, that you don't have any control over, this is how you would do it. You change the prototype. Okay, so now let's talk about the next piece of syntactic sugar. This is a constructor function, but it technically does represent a class. So this part, this looks like other languages. Java, PHP, Python, C++. They all do new objects in the same way, but this is not how they do them. They don't do constructor functions. So recently, in the last couple years, JavaScript has added the concept of a class. So let's take a look at what that looks like. It starts with class, and then the name of the class, and then curly braces. Similar to a block, okay? This declares a class. If you want to declare properties on the class, you still do them on a constructor. But here's the kicker. Inside this block, we're declaring methods. So see how we have verify login? This is what verify login would look like in a class. You notice we don't have function because we know this is a function. JavaScript assumes that the fact that you put something inside these curly braces like this means it is a function, so it doesn't need the function keyword. Functions are methods by default. So if I wanted info, I could just put this up here and I could say info. Notice it still has access to the this. This still refers to that object that has been created. But where do we set these properties? This is not a function. This is a class. So if I put this here, JavaScript's just going to get confused. You can see it says, what is this? I wasn't expecting that. Well, there's a special method that we put inside a class called constructor. Constructor is just like any function. It takes in the properties, and because it's in the context, you can set various things on it. I could also at this point say verify login equals function, but I can also do that here, so I'm not going to do it inside the constructor. So this may look a little weird to those of you who have not done any other programming language. For people who have done Java or C++ or any other programming language that does normal classes, this is starting to look very familiar to you because this is how classes are done in other languages. For those of you that are just learning Java, you're saying, well, why? Why do we do this? Well, because it's a very clear structure. if I come across this function user and I see this, I can probably guess that it's a constructor function. But sometimes it's a little unclear. Sometimes like maybe there's a bunch of other random stuff here, right? And it takes a little while before I get to the this and I say, oh, okay. Maybe it's also even lowercase because there's no reason you have to make the function uppercase. That's just a convention. So I say, okay, this is a function for user and it does some stuff. That's weird. That doesn't tell me it's a constructor function by default. There's still some ambiguity in there. Classes, there's no ambiguity. You know it's a class because it tells you right up here, this is a class. It can't be anything else. There's no possible way this is a function. It has to be a class. So it just makes your code a little clearer. It makes your structures clearer as to what you're doing. So if I do this, and then I'm going to comment out this function here, notice I can still do the prototype. The fact that I've put this as a class doesn't change the fact that I can put prototype on it. So if I run this code, you can see it does exactly the same thing, even though it's now using a class. All right. So that's a class. The constructor function is what gets called when you use new. So new user, this code maps directly to this function, the constructor function. This is what gets called. Then any other function just is something that you can just call as if it was added directly to the object that gets returned. So it makes things a little cleaner, but it can be a little confusing if you're not familiar with the concept. Okay. Now, let's look at inheritance. So classes, and actually we had this in JavaScript before, but it was a little weird. You can add something. Let's say we have a class. We have user, and we want to make an admin. Okay, admins are users that have special privileges. They have the ability to do additional things. They can see additional pages. They can make changes that users can't. However, we still want them to be able to log in. We still want to have info, and we still want to have the same various things on them. So we want them to be users, but we want them to have special things. What can we do with that? We could actually just put something special on user that gives it a flag that says, oh, this is an admin. Let's do some special things with that. But that gets a little complicated, and the user class starts to get really confusing. So we're going to define a new class, admin. Now, we could just grab all this stuff, put it in admin. Now, let's say that user is a new admin instead. You can see now all of a sudden it doesn't get update username. Why? Because that's on the prototype of user. It doesn't belong to admin. So, we go here and we say, okay, sure, let's put that on admin too. Run that, that's okay. But now if we all of a sudden say, okay, we want to update info now so that we capitalize user, okay, well then we have to remember to go down here and do it too. We start running into the same problem as before, where now we've got duplicate code. We don't like it when we're duplicating code. What can we do? Well, we can actually say admin extends user. What does that do? If I pull all of this stuff out and get rid of this completely, it just magically works. How does it magically work? Well, what happens in JavaScript is it says, okay, new admin. Let me look at the admin class. Does admin class have a constructor? It does not. I haven't defined a constructor in here. Oh, it has a parent. It extends something. We call user the parent class in this point, and admin the child class. Admin has a parent class. Well, let's look at the parent class. Does that have a constructor? Yes, it does. Okay, well, we're going to call that then. Same with info. Okay, does admin have info? No, it doesn't. Well, let's look at the parent class. That does have info. We're going to call that. Let's say I did actually define a constructor for admin, and I'm going to use the same username, password. But for admins, I'm going to do something special. I'm not going to give them an email for whatever reason. Okay, so they have a different constructor, but we still want all these fields to be set. Well, what we could do is we could go in here. We could say, okay, and this.email equals admin email not set. Okay. Now if we run this, you see it's giving us an error. Must call superconstructor and derive class for accessing this. So I'm going to throw this in here really quick, and then I'm going to explain to you what it means, just so that we get this working. Okay, So now you can see, in this case, our user, because it's an admin, the email becomes undefined. Oh, because I misspelled email. The email becomes admin email not set because we've overridden this. What does super do? Super is kind of a poorly named term, but what it basically says is whatever I'm currently doing, super is the user object in this case. Super is the same thing as if I said user, except user wouldn't work here because of the way JavaScript is set up. Super specifically says, okay, I'm in the constructor, call my parent constructor. And you notice when we didn't do that, it actually errored out. It said, hey, you must call the super constructor before accessing this or returning from derived constructor. It wants us to call this just in case. So that means that we don't actually need any of this. I can just pass the ID and admin email not set into my super constructor. And everything works exactly the same. Why? Because basically what happens, I say new admin. It looks in admin, it says, oh great, you have a constructor method, let me call that. That method immediately said, oh, let me call my parent constructor, which then calls this and sets all these fields. So this can be a nice way to override something. So if you still want to verify login. So let's say we want to verify login, but we want to do a very more strict login, right? I can actually redefine verify login here. First, I want to check the user login. So let's just say this is saying, okay, let's take a username in here. Username, or actually, let's do this. Email and password, right? So let's say return email, this dot was email and this dot password, password. Okay, so now it's a slightly better login. Well, I can duplicate this over here, right? Email, password. But I also could just call super.verifyLogin password. What this does is it's going to call, if I say, okay, user.verifyLogin at test.com, and then, oops, test pass. Okay, what this is going to do is this is going to call up to the constructor, right, and build that. But then when I do verify login, it's going to pass these in, and then it's going to say, okay, well, let me call the login of my super, of my user parent. Goes up here and runs this code. In this particular case, we're actually not allowing the email to be set. So I'm going to change that a little bit. I am actually going to put the email in here just so we can do that. So first I'm going to super verify login, and I'm going to say user login. So then if not user login, return false, because if the user couldn't log in, then we're good. Then I'm actually going to do another thing. Verify login here, I actually want to take a username because we're doing an admin login. Okay, so here I'm going to say, okay, verify login, username as well. That's a little different from the user. So if I was dealing with user 2, I would just pass in the email and the password. And that would be enough for its login. Why? Because user 2 is a user, not an admin, so it's using this verify login. In this case, my admin takes in 3 parameters. It's going to use 2 of them to verify the user. Then it's going to say, okay, return this.username. Username. It's going to do a username check as well. Maybe not the best example of this, but you can see how we have a function here now that it does what its parent does, but it also does something more. And that's not uncommon for this stuff. This is why you would use super. You would say, okay, let me do what my parent needs to do, but then I'm also going to do some additional stuff because I'm more complex. Admins are more complicated than parents. I can also create another function that's like do admin task. And I can say console.log doing task, task. And now here I can come down here and I can say user.doAdmin task. What would an admin do? Setup SSO. Okay, and if I run that, you can see I can do that. If I do this on user 2, user 2 will fail because it doesn't have a do admin task. It's not an admin, it's a user. So this is the case where you can use inheritance. Now you can see we have some logic in our user that we're not duplicating in admin. In fact, now this constructor, because these are the same, I can actually just get rid of it. And our verify login, we have another method, but our login is more complicated. And so admin is a user. It has all of the privileges of user. It has all of the functions of user. So it has info, it has constructor, it has verify login, but it also has some additional functionality. Inheritance is really powerful in this way. What it allows you to do is it allows you to take common repeated actions and put them into a more generic class like user. Like let's say we need to be able to delete a user. Well, we probably put that delete method on the actual user object. We wouldn't need to put it on admin unless admin needs to do something special to delete itself. In that case, we would also delete here, do our thing, and then we would call the user delete. So anything that is common to all users, we can put in the user class, and anything that is not, that's special, we can extend the user class and put that special logic in. That's all I got for today. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you all in class.